Okay, so welcome back, everybody. So without much further ado, could I just invite you to take the digital stage and to start your talk?
All right. Thanks very much. It's really a pleasure to be here. Let's see, is it going to let me share a portion of my screen? Come on. Here we go. All right. So tell me how that looks. Can you see my slides?
Yeah, that looks great. Wonderful.
All right. Well, thank you so much for that kind introduction. It's really a pleasure to be here. And I'll have to say also, I had the opportunity to meet with my fellow presenters earlier and helping to plan this session. And it was just such a pleasure. I think despite the long distance that we're traversing, I really feel connected to you all and to this event. So I thought, since I am coming from far away, not everyone knows where Oregon is. We're the little heart there on the left of the US above the state of California. And on the right is a picture of a place, a river near to where I live that is just, it's a beautiful state and a beautiful area. And I invite you all to come visit. And it's become traditional recently also to acknowledge that the US is a settler country, and that means that the people who lived on these traditional lands were displaced to make way for the Western society that we and people that we have today. But the Kalapuya people, who are the traditional peoples of my area, continue to live in our area and contribute to our university and our community in important ways. So reproducibility is a challenge, and there's many parts to it. So in the next 25 minutes, I'm going to offer a gentle introduction to computational reproducibility specifically, which is the ability to rerun code and recreate data or figures associated with a scientific paper. And here I'm not really talking as much. I think the issues in the idea of reproducibility in the humanities are super interesting. This talk is really more focused on papers in whatever field that have a very computational element. And I want to focus on computational reproducibility because it's hard, it's intimidating, it's something that people are less familiar with, and also because it builds on the best practices that Dr. Hetna introduced in her presentation. And so in this paper, I'll use the citizen science paper that Dr. Hetna discussed as a use case for exploring computational reproducibility. And I'm going to demonstrate that we can actually fairly easily reproduce a sample piece of their code, which is quite impressive considering that it's already 3 years old. Even as I'll point out a few ways that if you wanted to take this further, you could do some things to document the computational environment. But before I do that, I'd be really interested if you want to put in the chat, because I don't know very much about you, our audience, what tools you've used, if any, for computational reproducibility, or is this an entirely new topic for you? And I'll pause for a moment. But I'll also keep going, but keep an eye on the chat. So if you're not expecting to be asked a question and you want to add that answer in as we go along, please do so. All right. Okay, so someone says they've used PackRat. That's great. Yeah, someone else says it's entirely new to them. Yeah, absolutely. Oh, and funders want to fund reproducibility tools. Yeah, that's so exciting. Docker. Okay, great. Yeah, we're going to talk a lot about Docker today. Excellent. Okay. Well, and new make and new to you. Okay, so yes, so as I guessed, there's really a range of people who are either very familiar and specifically with the tool that we're going to talk about today, and then others for whom this is completely new. So hopefully I will have threaded the needle of this large range of audience well, but you will, of course, be the judge of that. So I decided to begin by sort of talking about our paper in relation to a reproducibility checklist that was recently published in Nature as part of a kind of descriptive article talking about something called the 10 Years Reproducibility Challenge, where researchers were invited to reproduce code, either their own or someone else's, that is at least 10 years old, to see if they can make it all run again. So I've taken this checklist, which I invite you to explore, and modified it a little bit, broken it into sections here. So the first step are things that are connected to what I would call literate programming, right? So using code and also documenting that code. This paper did a great job of a lot of that work. What it didn't do was define the parameters or really the computational environment very much. So again, this is another view just of that same code. And as Dr. Hetna noted, it's really, really well organized and labeled. As we also saw, right, it's tracked using that Git version control. That's why Dr. Hetna was able to show it on GitHub. It doesn't appear to have used testing or automation. If those concepts are unfamiliar to you, they're very standard practice in software development. And of course, I think one of the real challenges for us as academics is the degree to which we're suddenly being expected to use all of these best practices from software development in our own work. Another element is archiving, right? So the citizens science paper used open source software and very standard code libraries, and then archived the paper on Zenodo, as well as sharing it on GitHub, right? So GitHub is for sharing in the present moment, but it's a company owned by Microsoft, right? They might decide to change what they're doing at any moment or change their business model. So archiving on Zenodo, which is backed by CERN and by the EU, is a much stronger standard. And then another thing you can do is test your code in a range of computing environments. I'm not sure if they did that, but it sure does work quite well, which is very impressive in my computing environments. What they didn't do was use some kind of packaging of a software environment to retain a record of their environment and code. We can still, however, use those to read about, to recreate their work, and that's what I'll show you today. So if you wanted to package your code, or if you, let's say, have a different version of R than the version of R that would allow you to run this software, and you don't want to mess up your computer, how can you use a package, some sort of virtual environment to do that, and why? So let's start with why. So software changes over time, right? So in Python 2, the slash mark suggests integer, or what's called floor division, by which 1 divided by 2 here over on the left is equal to 0, right? Because it's only division in increments of an integer. In Python 3, the same symbol approximates true division for all data types. And that obviously gives us a more recognizable answer of 0.5. So, if you're doing calculations, this is going to make a huge difference depending on what your code looks like. And this is a particularly dramatic example, but, recently the R programming language updated the way that they managed a default in the way that text or strings are imported. And that broke a lot of people's code. So these things happen, they're inevitable, there's not much we can do about it. The environments behind them change. This is a screenshot of one of the scientists in this computational 10 years code challenge reproduced some code in Visual Basic. Well, Visual Basic is a proprietary software from Microsoft. So there was this problem of licensing. The scientist decided he had owned Visual Basic at the time, and that sort of fulfilled the spirit, if not the letter of the license, and he virtualized, because he was himself the one who had written this 20 or 30, probably 30 years ago. But this is an image, right? I think some of you might recognize, of a Mac computer, but inside it there is a virtual computer that's pretending to be, let's say, from the 90s. So part of what's challenging about thinking about computational reproducibility is the range of different kinds of tools that are available, right? So there are package managers, there are web-based replays, which are really more related to when the journal itself, maybe such as the eLife journals. There are some journals where they're creating a replay or interactive environment with the code within a web-based journal itself, right? Then there are virtual machines. So there's a really wide range of tools available, and it can be very intimidating. The tools also are really focused on different things, right? So a lot of the tools available are really focused on proximate reproducibility, right? Can I share this with my colleagues now? Can someone who reads it in the next few years reproduce it? And there, I think really the question is maybe what are your skills, and also what are the skills of your readers? Who are you hoping will reproduce it, get excited about it, cite your work, reuse your work, right? What will their skills be? What kind of tools are they going to be using? And what are mine, right? Those might be some of the questions you would ask as you decide what kind of tool to use. In terms of archival reproducibility, you know, we really can't predict what's going to happen to computation in the future, which is why documentation and using archival repositories are really going to be the most essential things, you know, doing things like naming your code, explaining what versions you're using, and so on. So what exactly is a container, and how might it compare to a virtual machine? So I think many of us have used a virtual machine. We find it a little bit more intuitive, right? You have whatever the infrastructure is over here on the bottom right. And then there's the hypervisor, the program that runs the virtual machine. And then that virtual machine is a whole machine, right? So they take up a lot of space. I wish that I had access to a Windows operating system so that I could demo things for my students, but putting the entire Windows operating system on my computer as well, and then the apps, would take up, you know, half of the space of my computer, right? So it's a heavy duty thing. On the other hand, a container such as Docker just has, you know, my laptop itself, my host operating system, which is a Mac, and then I'm just running Docker, and it has a much lighter, little container for each of the apps. It doesn't have an entire operating system. So let's try running the citizen science code in a Docker container. So one challenge is that in this README, it's a great README, but it doesn't specify the code versions or dependencies. So we're just going to have to guess. And I'm going to use a Docker container from the Rocker project, which focuses on scientific reproducible R environments. And so I'm going to use a container called the Rocker Tidyverse container. It has, so Debian is a Linux that is an operating system, but it's not the full heavy operating system. It's just the very minimal amount that's needed to run RStudio, which is the kind of interactive environment. And then the Tidyverse, which is the suite of code packages that are being used by this paper. So this is the code to open a simple Docker container with RStudio using this Docker image. And I'm actually going to switch over and we'll see if this works live, right? So that's that code. It's telling the computer, run this container, and tell the container to also look at my own computer where I have the files from this project, and also expose this on port 8787. All right, so I tell it to run. And it starts it up. And now I'm going to go over to port 8787 in my browser. And sure enough, now the documentation tells me that RStudio should be my username. And I've assigned Leiden as the password. And what happens is, if you are familiar with RStudio, it opens up an RStudio session. And if I look at my documents here, because I told it to look in the folder where the code from this paper is, it appears right there. So let's go ahead and open that abundance analysis that Dr. Hetna alerted us to earlier, that we looked at earlier, and just try to run the code. So I'm going to go ahead, I'm going to make this a little bit smaller, and I'm just going to try running all of the code chunks. And wow, this is really quite impressive, right? They did a very good job of writing straightforward code. It runs great. But if we scroll down, we're going to see that we are going to run into one error message. So it says unable to load shared object, blah, 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 no such file or directory. So how would we even know what to do, right? Well, because this is a talk, I of course looked this up in advance. And I, through some Googling, found out that what happened is that this piece of code that allows you to create PNGs, which is the data type of the image, was missing. And so here, someone has put in some instructions about what you can do to fix this. Now, in real life, you would want to check, who is this? Is this really the right instructions and not just some sort of code that tells you to go hack an oil pipeline, as just happened a minute ago. But what it explains essentially is that underlying Debian this base Linux operating system image is missing an important component that's needed to run this. So it says run this code. So we're going to run this in the terminal. This talks to the computer, but in this case, the computer in question is that Docker container. It's not my underlying computer. Okay, we can see that from this string of numbers here. I'm just going to paste that in. It runs real quick. And now if we look back at the home, we can see before it just said documents, now there's this new libpng that was missing before. And if we run this little chunk of code again, what we'll see is that little thing, that little error message disappears and it's creating the PNG correctly, which is really great. So it was wonderful that we were able to solve that within our system. But of course, this kind of dependency, right? That's what was going on. It depended on another program to make this work. If it's not all documented and taken care of, it's not always as easy to fix as this. And that's really what you're trying to get at when you document. This is all the screenshots in case none of this worked in person. But that's really what we're trying to get at when we talk about documenting your code and using those environments. So if all of this sounds hard and intimidating, start small, right? What are your goals with a particular project and where is your skill set? Can you add one new step or tool to your process? And as you think about what to add, consider the tools, archives, or processes popular in your own field. What's going to speak to your colleagues? Document and organize, right? It is really that we all suffer from expert blindness. We forget what we know and what is obvious to us. So ask someone who doesn't know your project to test your data and code and tell you what they don't understand. Don't explain to them in advance how to do it. Give them just, the screen and have them poke around, and they'll say, wait, which file should I be in when I open this other file? Which one goes first? I don't understand, right? Remember that everyone will know less in the future, including you. So plan for that. And where can I learn more? So here's just a few resources that I think might be helpful. And I'm going to go ahead and place those into the chat. So in just a moment. So thank you so much for your time.
Well, thank you, Gabrielle, for this fascinating, very informative talk. I like your remark at the end that we will probably all know less in the future. Though I'm not quite sure whether I should see that as a reassurance or whether I need to be worried about this. But in any case, it was a great demonstration of what computational reproducibility can entail at a very practical level.